I'd like to present Professor Aswath Damodaran. He sets the bar for graduate education and is consistently named one of the best teachers in the world. He's professor of finance at New York University's Stern School of Business, and it's an honor and a privilege to welcome him for the conversation. It looks like we're recording. It's a privilege and an honor to have Professor Damodaran on the program, and he is widely known as one of the experts in valuation and finance, and we're going to talk a little bit about his upbringing and his life as a young man, because Professor, you tell this great story of growing up, then you take a class where you are given Moby Dick to read, and then you start discussing the book, and the teacher says, no, it's not about a whale. And you're like, I really remember a massive fish in this book. And it sets you on a path towards mathematics and the truth in it that you find in numbers. So if you could give us a 10-cent tour of your mom and your dad, where you grew up and what you were like as a kid.
I grew up in South India in a city called Chennai. It used to be called Madras. And to give you some background, India is a conservative country. It's a very, lots of heritage, lots of tradition. And South India is more traditional than most. So I actually grew up in the most conservative part of a conservative country. So I grew up in a family that had probably lived on the soil that they were on for thousands of years, generations and generations, and steeped in family and culture, simply because there was nothing else to do. There was no TV. In fact, TV had not come to Chennai when I was growing up, so there's no TV to watch. So we'd have family gatherings, and there were joint families. So dozens and dozens of cousins would gather together. We all lived in the same city. So I lived on conversation, on listening to people who are older than me talk about politics, about economics. And while I was too young to contribute, I learned by osmosis, by sitting there and listening. And so I grew up probably the same way that hundreds of generations of people in my family had grown up through time. And in a way, what I did was a break with history, because I grew up at a time when India was changing, TV was coming into it. I'm using TV as my kind of entry point into how the modern world came into Chennai. I left Chennai to go off to college. I left because I needed to expand my horizons. India had lots of things to offer, but a postgraduate education was not one of them. So I went to UCLA, got my MBA and PhD, and my original plans were to go back to India. We have a family business. We run gas stations in South India, and my father expected me, generations before me, to come back and run the family business. And for me, there are moments of grace when you learn that, if you're open to that, you learn what makes you happy. And for me, that happened when I was a TA for an accounting class of all classes. If you've ever heard me talk about accounting, it's not one of my favorite subjects. But I was a TA for accounting at UCLA. I did it purely for the money because I needed to get through my second year of my MBA program. My plans were to go to work in investment banking in 1981. And the last quarter of my MBA, I went in and decided to be a TA. And I walked in, and 15 minutes into the class, I knew that this is what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. But that's what I call a moment of grace. I was just lucky. I was open to that possibility that change would come. And I was listening. And I tell people that all the time. There are moments when you will hear that voice saying, this is what you were meant to do. And if you're listening, you got your moment. And I got my moment, and I said, okay, I want to be a teacher. This is what I want to do. And since that day, when people ask me what I do for a living, I always describe myself as a teacher. I'm not a professor. I'm not an academic. I'm not an expert on valuation. I'm a teacher, first and foremost. So if I wasn't teaching finance, if I wasn't teaching valuation, I'd be teaching something else. My first love is teaching. My second love is finance and valuation. So to me, teaching is where I start, and valuation and corporate finance is where I've ended up doing my teaching. So it was. I mean, I'm glad we're all the products of how we grew up, and I'm glad I grew up the way I did because it made me who I am today. And it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. It is what I know. So it's and that moment in my English literature class is a moment that I'm sure every young kid has gone through when he realizes he's better at one thing than another, at writing rather than mathematics. And my advice to that kid, whether he's 10, 12, 15, 20, or 25, is work on your weak side, because our temptation as human beings is to take what we're good at and do more of it. And we live in a world which encourages us to specialize, to be more focused. And my encouragement is be less focused, be more broad, try to do things that don't come to you easily, because the world needs people who can traverse across multiple disciplines, do different things. So my upbringing was not special. It was just who I am. I was lucky enough to have a wonderful family that taught me the meaning and the value of family. I had the advantage of growing up in a part of the world where other temptations, entertainment did not get in the way. But what I think is something that's not used very much, which is the capacity to daydream, to sit and think about things. We're so focused on reading what other people write, on finding out what that's happening. It's so easy to do it now with Google search and looking, that we don't take the time to stop and think. And that, I think, is the scarcest resource out there, is sitting there and saying, hey, what do I think about politics, economics, whatever the matter of the day is, think for yourself, right? Don't let other people think for you.
It sounds like a very intimate and close family sort of upbringing. How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I have one brother and one sister. So they both live in India now. They live in Chennai still. So in fact, I'm going to go back to visit them in about 4 weeks. So I have one brother, one sister. I have 3 nieces, and I have 4. My wife and I have 4 kids ourselves. So.
And do you ever feel because now we're so distracted, you always see kids. There's this famous picture of these kids at the Louvre, and they're all staring at their phones instead of looking at the paintings. Do you ever feel a desire to bring that sort of intimacy back? And it's so difficult to do these days with being distracted, like you say, by so much technology, and to give that, is it difficult to give that ethic to your kids to just sort of settle down and to daydream and to get introspective into oneself?
You know what? You can't force a different way of life on your kids. They've got to find their own pathway. But let's face it, much as we like to talk about phones being a problem, they've made life easier for all of us. So you got to live in the world you're in, not the world you wished you were in. The world we're in, we are constantly going to be inundated by external forces. So we have to take the time. We have to force ourselves to take the time to kind of think for ourselves. I try to do that by example with my kids, but I think that in a sense they've got to discover their own pathway to doing that, and I'm sure they will. I've discovered my kids. They're their own people. I can't mold them. I can't make them do something. They will find their own way, and I love my kids, and I trust them enough to find that own pathway. Because I don't believe that the pathway I had was the only good one. I think there are multiple ways to get to where you are happy, because that's the end game. And if you can find a different pathway, all the more power to you. It's hubris on my part to believe that my pathway was the only way to get to where I
am. And this upbringing you have, do you think it, because you look at things, you're very, very knowledgeable, but you're able also to bring things down to such a simple way of thinking about complex problems and complex issues, and you talk out so eloquently about the life cycle of a company, that the company goes through the startup growth, maturity, and decline stage, and that companies that don't follow this and don't understand that are really going through a dangerous path. And you say that a company that does not act its age is the equivalent of a 50-year-old wearing hip huggers. And so, and much of what you do, and you say you talked about, you have this presentation where you have an envelope. You put a $20 bill in the envelope, and then you put in words like strategy and synergy, and say, now how much is it worth?
Don't forget China.
And then China, put in China. And that for me is so refreshing, because it really takes, and then you dive really deep and really hard. Is this something from your family? Is this something from the Indian culture? Is this this sort of outward looking thing? Or is this something that comes from you personally?
It's the essence of teaching. I mean, I told you as a teacher, the essence of teaching is you got to simplify. You've got to bring things down to basics, and you got to relate to things around you. I've discovered that when you use examples, when you talk about life cycles, people can relate. You don't have to be in finance to understand when somebody's not acting their age. Now, I live in La Jolla. All I need is I walk 2 blocks towards the beach. I'm surrounded by people who are having facial surgeries. The lips have been worked on, their cheek. You can see them trying so hard to be young. And at the same time, it's not working. It's actually, they're spending a lot of money trying to look young. So my thoughts for the life cycle actually came from looking around me. And in fact, much of what I do in analogy comes from looking at what my kids do, looking at what happens around me. Because I've discovered that in teaching, if you can take things which look complicated and relate them to what people see around them in everyday life, they're far more likely to remember what I'm trying to tell them than if I use abstractions or companies purely as my example. So I think that the essence of teaching is trying to break things down to basics and relating to everyday life. And that's what I try to do. So it's not, I don't think it has anything to do with upbringing. It's basically the teacher in me coming up. And I try, so I cringe when I'm on CNBC and somebody calls me the dean of valuation or the guru of valuation. Because I think this is the valuation as a discipline. We're all craftsmen. We have to work on our craft. I'm just a craftsman. And I try to take my valuations, I try to break them down. I try to tell the world what I think about a company. And I'm very clear that this is not my recommendation to them. I believe that every person should take responsibility for their own investing, which means if you want to buy Uber, do it, but do it on your own terms. Don't do it because Goldman Sachs put a buy recommendation. Don't do it because I might buy the company. Do it because you think it's a good investment. And if the defense you offer is, I'm not a finance person, I don't know valuation, valuation is simple. I can teach you enough valuation. You can take your story and make it into valuation. So whenever I value a company, it's not to put the valuation out there, but to put my valuation and give people a chance to disagree with it.
Yes, and so it seems like that you believe that active teaching is, in a way, an act of empowerment, that by giving this information, because what's so great, and let's maybe go screen share if we can, something you'd like to show us, your app, this web app that you have is just so incredible, because you have all of your lesson plans, then you have the tests and the answers, and it's just like going to school. It's just incredible. So Professor, if you'd like to share something for us and have us take a look, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so what you're going to see now is actually my homepage, and the homepage actually is where almost everything I do is on. There's very little that I do that I keep secret. There's nothing I do that is secret. That almost everything I do in terms of valuations, in terms of teaching, in terms of tools, in terms of blog posts, you can get to from my website, which is just damodaran.com. Now, the app you're talking about is an app that is for the iPhone and the iPad that you can get online on the Apple Store. And the app actually was the reason I co-developed that app with Anand Sundar, was a good friend of mine, is to tell people, look, You're paying people to do valuations for you, and all they're doing is plugging numbers into models and turning out these mechanized valuations. We can do that for you for free. It's really a shot across the bow against appraisers who charge you insane amounts of money for plugging into pre-designed models. So the app is actually an application. It's an extension of what I've done on my website. I've given away spreadsheets that allow you to do valuation, and they're open spreadsheets. I've never written a macro. I don't hide layers of data. Everything I do is on there. In fact, the most accessed part of my website is actually the data part. So I click on it because in the data part, I keep almost all of the data I collect and present to the world. So I present industry averages on pretty much any number you want, what kind of returns they make, what their PE ratios for companies in a particular sector are. So I keep the data, and you can download the data right from my website. So this is actually the most accessed part of my website. My estimate is about 5,000 to 10,000 people visited every single day. Weekdays, it's closer to 10,000. Weekends, it's closer to 5,000, just to download data. And it's, the raw data I get from S&P Capital IQ, Bloomberg, FactSet. And I have to be conscious of the fact that they don't want me to share the data. And I completely understand. They make their money by selling the data. What I do is I download the data, the raw data, into a large Excel spreadsheet, 43,000 companies. And then I collect and organize the data based on industries and report numbers so people can use them. And I do this for a simple reason. Data should not be so expensive that people can't afford it. But unfortunately, accessing raw data from the big data providers is incredibly expensive. A Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or a big investment bank in the US can pay for it. But if you're a Vietnamese analyst, there is zero chance you can afford to pay for it. The world is not democratic in terms of data. And what I try to do is a very small contribution to trying to make data available to people who otherwise would not have it. So the data portion of my website is where pretty much people who need data, who can't afford it, can go. And it's my small contribution kind of evening out the playing field as much as I can. If you stay on the website, you'll also see a link called teaching, and all the classes I teach are actually on there. My regular classes that I teach at Stern, the full class, you can watch every webcast with the slides. You can even take the exams. You can grade yourself. You won't get a certificate, but you can pretty much take the class in absentia. You might say, why does NYU allow it? It's my bargaining with NYU, which is I'll teach big classes for you, but in return, you have to let me put these classes online for free. I have online versions of these classes, which are much shorter, but basically cover the same content. So you can see my corporate finance class, my valuation class, my investment philosophies class essentially on there. So the teaching kind of covers my teaching components. You can watch it on YouTube. You can watch the videos. Incidentally, YouTube is something that I did not use till 5 or 6 years ago, and I've discovered that it is my most effective mechanism for getting to people, because it might be a reflection of how the world has changed. But when I put a blog post up for the last 4 or 5 years, I also put up a YouTube video of that blog post. The blog post takes about 15 minutes to read. The YouTube video takes about 15 minutes to watch. But 3 times more people watch the YouTube video than read my blog post. It tells you something about how people like to access information. Again, I'm not saying this is good or bad, but I have to reflect the times I'm in, not the times I wished I was in. So to me, it's a very effective mechanism to teach, because everything I do is an extension of teaching. So the teaching is where you can find pretty much everything I do. So my website is my repository for everything I do, as I said. Everything I write, everything I analyze is on there. And you can find a link from there to my blog, to my YouTube videos, to my app, pretty much everything that you might want to access.
That's fantastic. So we'll put the link to your website in the blog post. And so I don't want to take too much of your time. So if you don't mind, Bernard Pivot is a famous French talk show host. And he has 10 questions that he used to ask every one of his guests. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you the 10 questions of Bernard Pivot, just whatever comes off the top of your head, and then we can I'll let you get back to whatever you were doing. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, Professor. What is your favorite word?
What is my favorite word?
Yes, sir.
Value.
What is...
Because it's what I teach. It's also what I think should, whatever values you have. Yeah.
Absolutely. What is your least favorite word?
His favorite word. But.
But?
Because when you say sorry, but I got it right, but basically means, I'm not going to take responsibility because there's something else that explains what I do.
I hear you. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Challenging the status quo.
Challenging the status quo. What turns you off?
Hubris, false pride, arrogance.
What is your favorite curse word?
Dumb.
Dumb.
Because I think it hurts a lot more than all the other curse words, because it basically says you're stupid, you're not at my level, so I will not talk to you.
Wow. That's great. What sound or noise do you love?
Laughter.
Me too. Especially the laughter of my kids. What sound or noise do you hate?
Weeping. That's soft weeping, because that means the pain is deep.
Yes. What profession, other than your own, would you like to attempt?
Interesting. When you love what you do so much, you haven't even thought about alternatives. I'd like to be a tennis player.
A tennis player?
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite one today? Are you a tennis fan?
Roger Federer.
Roger Federer, yes.
Class act.
What profession would you not like to try to do?
An investment banker.
Okay. And then also, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you finally arrive at the pearly gates?
We've got apples here.
That was fantastic. All right, Professor Damodaran, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor and a privilege to have you on the podcast, and maybe we could do this again sometime.
Sounds good. I'll be glad to.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a safe trip to Moscow, right? You're heading there soon?
Yeah, I'm heading to Moscow on Wednesday.
Okay. Well, take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks much. Bye-bye.